The Kemp Instructional Design Model, also referred to as the Morrison, Ross, and Kemp Model, is a circular structure that is ultimately nonlinear, unlike common models like the Dick and Carey model and the Addy model. It specifically uses 9 independent core elements in the process to create products. The benefits to this are, first and foremost, its flexibility. Because it has no starting point, a designer can start at any specific section to be able to start the process. It's also good for multitasking because designers are encouraged to be able to, bind steps and combine steps together in order to get the process going. It's also assignable, which means that like large groups can work on different sections. And it's also cyclical, which means that it's open to a lot of different revisions. Ultimately, though, the rationale is that it forces the designer to take the perspective of the learner and focus on the goals, needs, priorities, and constraints of the students involved. When we look at the Kemp model compared to the Addy model, you'll notice that the Kemp model here spends a lot more time in the analyze phase. This allows for more returns to the center and revisions before an actual implementation. The design itself was developed by Dr. Gerald Kemp in his published work in 1971, Instructional Design, but it was perfected through the years with the work of Morrison, Ross, and Kalman in order to produce the 2010 work, Designing Effective Instruction, where things were modernized and fleshed out at greater detail. We'll notice that the Kemp here model is truly important in a lot of different design work, specifically the Saracen 1995 study that looked at the student-centered learning initiatives that were problem solution based. The Campbell et al. Study in 1997 that specifically looked at expeditionary learning with the outward bound model, and also Kearns and Anderson in 1997 that actually created an entire system-wide restructuring use in the New American Schools movement. Ultimately, when we look at the process, there is no specific order, but we'll start at the top. The instructional problem, as we look at it, defines the instructional learning objectives and challenges and allows for us to look at the true problem solution base of what we're looking at. When we look at the learner's characteristics, is truly important because it determines the learning styles, learning needs, and cognitive load of each one of the students. Because there's an infinite number of characteristics, it's important to look at the ones that actually affect this unit and the students that have been selected in the learning process. When we will look at task analysis, you see that this is very similar to the third stage of the Dick and Carey model, but also the analysis stage of the Addy model. In this section here, it's important to know the problem and characteristics of the learner to help inform the procedures that will make up our instructional unit. We also need to look at the instructional objectives. Specifically here, this focuses on the whole learner and determines the depth of understanding of the new material that the learner should be able to demonstrate at the end of said unit. We need to also look at the content sequencing. In this here, the designer analyzes the broad learning perspectives and objectives of the course and then chunks them into smaller pieces. This, of course, fits amazingly well with the constructivist model and ideology that argues that knowledge is built on stages. Next up, we have the instructional strategies. This is the sixth element and it's of the design and of activities that will assist in the course facilitation. Morrison et al. Argues that this step requires a certain level of creativity and problem solving to develop methods to overcome obstacles to student achievement. We also have the designing the message section here, where the designer decides what instructional resources are necessary to allow teachers to effectively teach and students to effectively learn. When looking at instructional delivery, it's important to take into account all of the support services that are available or that may be required to facilitate both teaching and learning activities. And finally, we have the evaluation instrument, in which we look at the actual models to assessment, both formative and summative, that will be used in the process. All of this makes a lot more sense when we look at a really good example. The example that we look at here is the idea of teaching grammar. The problem is that we have variability levels for our students, both in experience and exposure to information, but also how to translate that knowledge of grammar rules to actual word choices in writing. Then we would look at the learners. This critical step in my specific environment is to determine the amazingly stratified learning styles, ability levels, and learning objectives and learning needs that each one of my students has. I also would look at the task itself, and the goal would be to align the curriculum, the content here, with the writing skills necessary to write effective and correctly formed ideas. The objectives should be clearly linked to the Georgia Standards of Excellence, but also any kind of other state standards and broad-based learning goals to be able to make sure that all of the puzzle pieces fit in this process. We also importantly need to look at sequencing. Here we would use a lateral construction because all grammar instruction has to start with the understanding of like the types of words and how they're used to create meaning. So it has like a fixed constructivist pattern of development. And the strategy that we might use with our students is 25% less errors. To meet the specific needs of the students, though, a baseline should be established to determine the number of specific grammatical errors, and the students should only be assessed by their individual growth. We also need to look at the message here, that we would have the group to individual model, which we allow for group learning, but also like individual modeling. In the delivery process, we also need to make sure that we meet all the needs of our ESOL, ELL, special education, RTI, and 504 students to make sure we meet the needs of all students. And then ultimately, we would have time to look at the instruments, which would probably be the editing and revising process, so that we could, because real knowledge should be assessed in the student's ability to apply that newly acquired knowledge